The water that erupted from the stone fountain sent peasants fleeing in terror, convinced that demons had possessed their village well. Before we dive into the story, make sure to smash subscribe because tomorrow we have an extra special story for you that will blow your mind. Daniel Morrison's eyes snapped open to complete darkness, his body convulsing as ice-cold water filled his lungs. He thrashed upward, hands clawing at wooden planks above his head, splinters driving deep beneath his fingernails. His engineering mind processed the impossible, even as panic seized his body. He was trapped in some kind of wooden box, submerged in water, drowning in absolute blackness, his fist connected with rotting wood. The plank splintered, then gave way. Water rushed through the gap as Daniel forced his way up, breaking through into dim moonlight. He gasped, coughing up foul water that tasted of decay and earth. Around him stretched a primitive well, circular stone walls rising 20 feet to ground level. The modern concrete storm drain he'd been inspecting in Seattle was gone. His hard hat, his surveying equipment, his entire world vanished. Daniel treaded water, mind racing. The well's construction was ancient, fitted stones without mortar, techniques he'd only seen in historical texts. Hand-carved holds spiraled up the walls. He grabbed the lowest one, testing its strength before beginning the climb. His waterlogged work boots made each step treacherous. Halfway up, voices drifted down, not English, not Spanish, something guttural and harsh. He paused just below the rim, listening. Torchlight flickered above. Men argued in that strange language, their tone suggesting they'd heard the commotion. Daniel's hands were bleeding, his site supervisor's uniform torn and soaked. He looked like he'd clawed his way out of a grave. Which, he realized with growing dread, might be exactly what these people would think. The voices moved away. Daniel counted to 30, then hauled himself over the edge. The landscape that greeted him defied every rational thought. No power lines crossed the sky. No distant hum of traffic, no light pollution, just stars so bright they seemed fake, and a settlement of timber buildings with thatched roofs. Smoke rose from chimneys, pigs rooted in muddy streets. The smell hit him like a physical blow, human waste, animal dung, rotting vegetation. Seattle wasn't just gone, the entire modern world was gone. Daniel crouched behind the well, shivering in his soaked clothes. Think, analyze, solve. That's what engineers did. The well's construction suggested medieval Europe. The architecture looked northern, steep roofs for snow-load timber frame construction. But where? When? And how was any of this possible? Footsteps approached. Daniel pressed himself against the well's outer wall, but it was too late. A young woman carrying a wooden bucket screamed when she saw him. Her shout brought others running, men with actual swords, torches painting wild shadows as they surrounded him. Daniel raised his hands slowly. "Please," he said, knowing they wouldn't understand. "I'm not dangerous. I need help." They seized him roughly, binding his hands with coarse rope. One man prodded Daniel's work boots with his sword tip, muttering what sounded like questions. The steel-toed boots with reflective strips must have looked like sorcery to them. His digital watch had died in the water, but even the plastic band drew suspicious stares. They dragged him to the largest building, a timber hall with carved doorposts. Inside, smoke from a central fire pit stung his eyes. Men and women in rough wool clothing stared as he was forced to his knees before an elderly man in finer robes. This had to be their leader. The interrogation was hopeless. Daniel tried every language he knew. English, Spanish from his Texas childhood, technical Latin from engineering terms. Nothing worked. The leader barked orders. Guards stripped Daniel's boots and uniform jacket, examining them with deep suspicion. They found his wallet, soaked but intact, and recoiled from the plastic cards inside. The leader held up Daniel's driver's license, studying his photograph with an expression of growing alarm. He showed it to others, who crossed themselves and muttered what were clearly prayers. In their world, a perfect miniature portrait, trapped inside an indestructible substance, could only be dark magic. They locked him in a root cellar, dirt floor, stone walls, heavy wooden door barred from outside. Daniel sat in the darkness, methodically working through his situation. Time travel was impossible, yet here he was, in what appeared to be medieval Europe, with knowledge that was centuries out of place. His engineering database was intact in his mind, fluid dynamics, structural analysis, material science. But what good was knowing how to design a skyscraper when the best available steel was hand-forged iron? What use was understanding hydraulic pressure when there were no pumps, no pipes, no precision manufacturing? Water. The thought came unbidden. These people understood water. He'd climbed out of their well. But did they understand how to move it, how to control it, how to make it serve them instead of merely taking what nature provided? Morning light filtered through cracks in the door. Guards brought him coarse bread and thin porridge. Daniel ate mechanically, planning. He needed to demonstrate value without seeming threatening. He needed something visual, impressive, but buildable with medieval technology. The opportunity came 3 days later. The leader, Lord Something, Daniel had gathered, brought a younger man who spoke halting Latin. Through painful translation, Daniel learned he was suspected of being a spy. The well incident hadn't helped. Emerging from sacred water at night marked him as either blessed or cursed. "I am a builder of water," Daniel said in his best Latin, hands sketching shapes in the air. "I make water serve man." The translator's eyes narrowed. "You are a sorcerer of water?" "No magic, only knowledge." Daniel grabbed a stick and drew in the dirt floor. "Water flows downhill, always. Use this law." He sketched a simple aqueduct, showing elevation change and flow direction. The Lord leaned forward, interested despite himself. Through the translator, he asked pointed questions. Could Daniel make water flow uphill? Could he bring water to the castle on the hill? Could he make the wells produce more? Daniel chose his words carefully. Water cannot flow uphill without force, but, he drew rapidly, water from high places can be brought to lower places far away. Roman knowledge. He used the Latin term deliberately, hoping it carried weight. The Lord conferred with his advisors. Finally, through the translator, "You will demonstrate this knowledge. Success brings position. Failure brings death." They gave him a test that seemed designed to ensure failure. A noble's manor sat halfway up a hillside, too high for wells to reach groundwater. Water had to be carried up daily by servants, backbreaking work that occupied a dozen people. Could Daniel bring water to the manor? He surveyed the situation with 2 guards watching his every move. The nearest water source was a spring almost a mile away, but Daniel's pulse quickened. It emerged from the hillside above the manor's elevation. Gravity-fed water was possible. The challenge was distance and materials. A mile of pipeline in medieval times? Impossible. But what about an open channel? Daniel had seen Roman aqueducts, studied their engineering. The gradient would be critical. Too steep and erosion would destroy it. Too shallow and the water wouldn't flow. Daniel sketched his plan using charcoal on flat stones. A channel following the hillside's natural contours, maintaining a precise slope. Stone lining where necessary, packed earth where stone was scarce. Simple but effective, if he could achieve the right gradient. The Lord provided workers, suspicious peasants who clearly expected to be digging their own graves. Daniel had no surveying equipment, no levels, no theodolite. But he had something else, the fundamental principle that water always finds its level. He created a primitive water level using a long wooden trough filled with water. By keeping the water surface constant and measuring down from it, he could establish a consistent gradient. The workers watched in amazement as Daniel used this simple tool to mark a path across the hillside that seemed random, but followed an invisible line only he could see. Days blended together. Daniel worked from dawn to dusk, adjusting the channel path to avoid rock outcroppings and unstable soil. He taught workers to shape stones for lining, to pack earth in layers for stability. Without modern tools, every foot of progress was a battle. The breakthrough came when they hit a layer of clay. Daniel recognized its potential. Immediately, natural waterproofing. He had the workers excavate carefully, using the clay to line the channel bottom. It would reduce water loss through seepage, increasing flow efficiency. 2 weeks in, skeptics had become believers. The channel snaked across the hillside, a precise serpentine path that maintained its critical gradient. Workers who had started sullenly now competed to lay the straightest stones, pack the firmest earth. They were building something unprecedented, a river that flowed where man commanded. The test day arrived with fanfare. Nobles gathered at the manor while peasants lined the hillside. Daniel stood at the spring where his channel began, a simple wooden gate holding back the water. His mouth was dry. 1,000 things could go wrong: erosion, blockage, insufficient gradient, structural failure. He opened the gate. Water surged into the channel, a muddy torrent that disappeared around the first bend. Daniel jogged alongside, watching for failures. The water slowed as it found its level, clearing as sediment settled. Around the second curve, past the rock outcropping, through the clay-lined section. Workers cheered as water flowed past their positions. The manor came into view. Daniel had terminated the channel at a stone cistern he'd designed, a simple holding tank that would gravity feed into lower distribution points. The water approached, slowed, then spilled into the cistern with a sound like music. Silence fell. Then the noble's wife, who had carried water up that hill her entire life before marrying, began to weep. The implications were staggering. No more bucket brigades, no more servants spending half their day hauling water. Fresh water available at the turn of a wooden spigot. The Lord himself inspected the system, walking its entire length. He studied the gradient marks, the stone lining, the clay waterproofing. When he returned, he spoke directly to Daniel, the translator forgotten. "You bring Roman secrets back to life. You will teach others." What happens next will turn this entire kingdom upside down, reveal how one man's knowledge could transform medieval life, and remind us why sometimes the greatest power flows from understanding nature's simplest laws. Stay tuned to see what happens next. If you're enjoying the story, please like, share, and subscribe for more. Daniel's position changed overnight. No longer a prisoner, he was installed in quarters near the Lord's hall. Servants who had feared him now brought gifts: fresh bread, preserved fruits, a warm cloak to replace his strange foreign clothes. The translator, William, became his constant companion, teaching him the local dialect while learning about water systems. But success brought new challenges. Every noble within 3 days' ride suddenly had urgent water problems. A castle on a cliff needed water lifted from the valley below. A monastery wanted their fish ponds connected to create flowing water. A merchant guild demanded fountains for the town square to attract more commerce. Daniel chose his projects carefully. Gravity-fed systems were straightforward. He could teach local builders the surveying techniques and let them handle construction. But the castle on the cliff posed a real challenge. Without pumps, lifting water seemed impossible. Then he remembered something from a historical engineering course: the hydraulic ram pump. No external power needed, just flowing water and clever use of water hammer effect. The principle was simple: use the momentum of falling water to drive a small portion uphill. Medieval technology could build it if he could work out the details. Daniel spent weeks on the design. Cast iron would be ideal, but local blacksmiths could only produce wrought iron in small quantities. He redesigned using stone chambers and leather flap valves. The prototype was ugly but functional. For every 10 gallons that flowed through, 1 gallon was pushed uphill. The demonstration drew crowds. Water flowing uphill without human labor, without animals, without visible magic. Just the steady thump-thump-thump of the ram pump cycling. Priests were called to verify no demonic forces were involved. When they declared it clean, orders flooded in. Daniel established a workshop in town. He trained apprentices, bright young men who could grasp the mathematical relationships between flow rate, pipe diameter, and pressure. They learned to read his drawings, to calculate gradients, to predict flow rates. It was the birth of civil engineering in a world that desperately needed it. The town transformed. Public fountains appeared at major intersections, not just decorative, but functional water sources that reduced disease by providing clean flowing water. Public baths were built, modeled after Roman designs, but improved with Daniel's knowledge of water circulation and drainage. Property values shifted dramatically. Land near water sources became less critical as Daniel's aqueducts could bring water miles away. Marginal hillside properties suddenly became valuable when fitted with gravity-fed water systems. Social dynamics changed as servants spent less time hauling water and more on productive tasks. But the biggest change was agricultural. Daniel introduced controlled irrigation, designing systems that could water fields precisely when needed. Crop yields increased. Farmers who had barely survived now produced surplus. The regional economy began to shift from subsistence to prosperity. 5 years after emerging from that well, Daniel stood before a gathering of Europe's brightest minds. Word of his innovations had spread along trade routes. Engineers, though they weren't called that yet, came to learn. Daniel had developed a standardized curriculum, basic surveying, hydraulic principles, materials science adapted for medieval resources. He taught through practical examples. Design a water system for your own town, calculate the flow rate needed, survey the route, solve the problems. His students returned home and transformed their regions, each adding their own innovations. The political implications were profound. Lords who controlled water sources had held power through scarcity. Now, any settlement with access to distant springs or rivers could thrive independently. Traditional power structures adapted or crumbled. Wars were fought over spring rights rather than wells. Daniel married Elizabeth, William the Translator's daughter. She was brilliant in her own right, managing the business side of their engineering consultancy, while Daniel focused on design. Their children grew up sketching aqueduct profiles and calculating flow rates, but Daniel's masterwork was yet to come. The king himself commissioned a project: bring water to the capital city, bypassing the polluted river that had caused disease for generations. It would require a 15-mile aqueduct crossing 2 valleys and tunneling through a hillside. Daniel assembled his best engineers. They surveyed for months, finding a route that maintained the critical gradient while avoiding unstable ground. The valleys required massive stone arcades, not as grand as Roman aqueducts, but engineered with superior understanding of load distribution. The tunnel was the greatest challenge, a mile through solid rock with medieval tools. Daniel introduced shift work and systematic excavation techniques. He designed ventilation shafts that also served as survey points to ensure the tunnel stayed on course. Progress was agonizing, sometimes just inches per day. 3 years into construction, disaster struck. Heavy rains caused a landslide that destroyed a section of completed channel. Critics who had always resented Daniel's influence called for the project's abandonment. The king wavered, costs mounting beyond all projections. Daniel surveyed the damage with Elizabeth. The slide had revealed something interesting, a layer of impermeable rock that could serve as natural channel lining. He redesigned that section to take advantage of the discovery, creating a more stable and efficient system, but he needed to restore confidence. Daniel proposed a demonstration. They would complete a 5-mile section and show water flowing. It would prove the system worked even if the full distance wasn't finished. The king agreed to one last chance. The demonstration day was scheduled for the harvest festival when crowds would be largest. Daniel's team worked frantically to complete their section, lining channels, securing joints, testing gradients. The night before, Daniel walked the entire route one last time, checking every detail. Morning came gray and drizzly. Perfect, actually, as it would keep the channel stones damp and sealed. Thousands gathered along the route. The king himself stood at the terminus point where water would emerge if everything worked. Daniel opened the control gates. Water surged into the channel, disappearing into the distance. He mounted a horse and rode alongside, watching for failures. The crowd followed, a growing procession tracking the water's progress. Miles passed. The water flowed steadily, navigating every curve and gradient change. It reached the demonstration terminus and poured into the prepared cistern in a crystal arc. The crowd erupted. The king nodded approval. The project would continue. 2 more years of construction, but the aqueduct was finally complete. Clean water flowed into the capital for the first time in recorded history. Public health improved dramatically. The city grew, supported by reliable water infrastructure. Daniel stood on the highest arcade, watching water flow through channels he had designed, 20 years since that terrifying night in the well. He had changed this world fundamentally, introducing concepts centuries ahead of their time. But he'd been careful. No technologies that required precision manufacturing or exotic materials. Everything he introduced could be maintained and replicated with medieval resources. He hadn't just built infrastructure, he'd created a sustainable engineering tradition. His students had spread across Europe and beyond. Letters arrived describing projects in distant lands, irrigation in Spain, harbor improvements in Italy, even rumors of water systems in the Far East based on his principles. The knowledge propagated like water itself, finding its own level. Elizabeth found him on the arcade, as sunset painted the sky. Their eldest son was at university, a new institution partly inspired by Daniel's teaching methods. Their daughter was designing a water system for a convent, quietly breaking gender barriers. "Any regrets?" Elizabeth asked, knowing his history. Daniel considered. He missed coffee and hot showers and the internet. He missed the precision of modern tools and the power of modern machines. But he'd found something here, the satisfaction of solving fundamental problems, of seeing direct impact, of building a legacy that would last centuries. "No," he said finally, "this is what engineering is really about, making life better with whatever tools you have." The water flowed below them, following laws of physics that were eternal and universal. Daniel had simply helped people understand those laws a little sooner. The future would still arrive. Steam power, electricity, computers, but it would build on a foundation of systematic engineering thinking that he'd helped establish. As darkness fell, torches lit along the aqueduct route, their reflections dancing in the flowing water. It looked like a river of light connecting the highlands to the city, a physical manifestation of knowledge flowing from one place to another, one time to another. Daniel took Elizabeth's hand and headed home, leaving the water to flow as it would for centuries to come. Tomorrow brought new problems, new projects, new students eager to learn. He had found his purpose in this unexpected time, not to recreate his lost world, but to improve this one drop at a time. The boy who had nearly drowned in a medieval well had become the man who taught the medieval world to make water dance to human design. It wasn't the life he'd planned, but it was the life that mattered. And like the aqueducts he built, its impact would flow through generations, carrying the simple but revolutionary idea that understanding nature's laws was the first step to partnering with them. Thanks for watching this incredible story of how one man's knowledge transformed an entire kingdom. If you enjoyed this video, check out this next story about a surgeon who woke up in ancient Rome. You won't want to miss what happens when modern medicine meets gladiator battles.